Good evening. Please be seated. It is my great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Ronna Berger. She is the Catherine and Henry Geisman Chair in the Department of Philosophy at Tulane University and affiliate professor in Jewish Studies. She is the author of numerous publications on texts from the Greek philosophical tradition, as well as from the Hebrew Bible. I particularly want to highlight for you her book, The Phaedo, a Platonic Labyrinth, soon to be republished. Professor Berger is also a great friend of the college. She has lectured here at least 5 times, which might be a record. 6. 6, okay. That's an applause line. She is also the teacher and mentor of many of our graduates, as well as several faculty members, including myself. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Am I okay? You can hear me in the back? Yeah. It's wonderful to be back here. I do feel like it's home. Let's see if I remember everyone. Seth Applebaum, Charlie Barrett, April Olson, Michael Golliber. Who am I forgetting? Did I get you all? Yes. So anyway, it's terrific. And we have a wonderful cohort of grad students in my department who are alumni of St. John's. And where but St. John's would you have a crowd like this on Friday night to hear about Plato and the Bible? It's unbelievable. So thank you all for coming. I realized my first lecture was at Annapolis, and it was before probably most of you were born, 1997. My last lecture here was a couple of years ago on Joseph, a story of the Bible, and I've been since then moving toward trying to put together more this Jerusalem-Athens theme, the 2 roots of our tradition. And I like to try to leave it open whether, there's such a debate, I think an important debate, whether these 2 roots of our tradition are compatible or harmonious, or are they in conflict? And I think the rich thing is to leave it open and see what they both have to say. So I think I have an interesting way into that tonight. I hope you'll be able to follow me. So, and that way is the title of my lecture, Man, Woman, and the Wholeness of the Human, a Biblical and a Platonic Account. So, I hope this handout is too much probably to really follow while I'm talking, but it's great to go home and look up the things on here and read them again for yourselves. So that's one of my main motives for doing this. But there might be a couple passages that we can helpfully look at. So I'm starting with a kind of very brief introduction about just 2 roots of the Western tradition. The question of what it means to be a human being and how that is related to being a man or a woman lies at the core of many contemporary issues and concerns, problems, and debates. I'd like to turn this evening to the important appearance of this question in 2 texts, which represent the 2 roots of the West, Bible and Greek philosophy. These 2 writings, though not originally known to each other, which I always find amazing, apparently they didn't know of one another, bear a striking resemblance. The one is the speech on eros that Plato puts into the mouth of the comic poet Aristophanes in the Symposium. And the other, the account of man and woman formed out of the original human being in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. Also another unbelievable privilege and blessing of St. John's is I understand that many, many of you have read these 2 texts. And I can assure you that is not, you can't find an audience like that everywhere. Or almost anywhere. Both of these accounts are meant to explain life as we know it by appealing to an original state different in kind. They tell the story of a fall in which our human condition is understood as the result of divine punishment for a criminal deed by our ancestors. Almost everything I'm saying are things that we really could develop further, and I hope we'll come back to some of these things in the question period, especially that idea, why it's all presented as divine punishment. In each of these accounts, the primordial human being is complete, and the act of the deity who divides it in two makes every subsequent individual only a partial being, driven by the desire to restore its original wholeness. The differences in character and in plot that emerge from this common ground raise a number of intriguing questions about these works as representative of Jerusalem and Athens. What is the conception of the primordial, complete human, in contrast with the partial beings derived from that origin? What is the purpose of the God who splits that original whole into two individuals? Who is the agent responsible for transgressing the boundaries separating human from divine? And what is the motivation of that act? I can't answer these questions, but they're the good questions. Okay, I'm going on to I want to look at the symposium first. So this section is called An Assault on the Heavens and the Emergence of Eros, Aristophanes' speech in Plato's Symposium. Plato's Symposium, as I'm sure you all know, is devoted to a series of speeches on Eros. And the one by the comic poet Aristophanes seems to speak most powerfully to our human experience. At least I always think that. I'm always surprised people don't always agree with me on that, but it's a very powerful speech. One of my students once gave me a list of all the popular songs based on the Aristophanes speech. So Aristophanes introduces Eros as the most philanthropic god, the physician, concerned with those ills of the human condition which, if they could be healed, would lead to the greatest happiness. Now, whatever Eros, the healing god, may be able to accomplish, Eros, the passion, proves to be the disease from which we are suffering. And Aristophanes suggests, I think, it is incurable. Aristophanes' story traces this disease to a divine punishment that brings about a fall from our ancient nature. I'm quoting him using his formula. In its primordial form, that's, some of you know, the Platonic eidos, the primordial form of the whole human, the human being was a spherical body with 4 arms, 4 legs, 2 faces on a cylindrical net, 2 sets of genitals, and when it began running fast, it looked like a spinning circle turning cartwheels. So what's amazing about Plato, what he's put into the mouth of this poet, is how such a comic picture, it is really so laughable. It turns out to be maybe either tragic or profound. It starts out pretty funny, as that image, I hope, suggests. We were, as this shape attests, in the image of the cosmic gods, belonging to 3 kinds. Those descending from the sun, composed of 2 male halves. Those from the earth, 2 females, and the offspring of the moon, the androgynous, half man, half woman, which is what the Greek word androgynous means. So you all have that picture, right? The 3 kinds of whole beings composed of these 2 halves. Our kinship with the cosmic gods might have led to the characterization of humans as essentially theoretical beings who would find their fulfillment in contemplation of the cosmos as an ordered whole. But that is not the understanding Plato attributes to the comic poet. Now, Aristophanes does speak of the primordial humans having big thoughts. But what he means by this is great ambition driven by pride. It was exhibited by their attempt to mount high to the heavens, overstepping the limits separating them from the Olympian gods. Zeus and the other gods are disturbed by this threat to their power. And though initially at a loss, Zeus is initially perplexed. After all, if human beings are simply annihilated, there'll be no one left to honor the gods. But he soon hits upon a strategy. If I could split each human being in 2, they would each be weaker, and yet at the same time, more plentiful worshipers. So I think Zeus outdoes Machiavelli, but yeah. So, and then, if human pride makes it necessary, Zeus reasons, he could split the half beings once again. so that each of us would be only a profile hopping around on one leg, like those Egyptian pictures. Aristophanes finds a comic image for the deeds of a tyrant god. But before the quartering of human beings becomes necessary, Zeus finds another expedient. He orders Apollo to turn the faces of the half-beings toward the cut side, because after all, like you're a hole, you cut in half, your face would be on the outside. Turn the faces toward the cut side, so that the sight of our punishment would serve to induce moderation. The comic contingency of our human shape, like wrinkled skin around the belly button, I mean, it is weird when you think about it. In this speech is to be a painful reminder of the loss of our original completeness, with the possibility always just on the horizon of further fragmentation and alienation from the whole self. Human beings whose ancient nature was in the image of the cosmic gods are literally cut down to size by the anthropomorphic Olympians, the gods of the city, who impose the constraints of law and remake humans in their own image. Eros, as Aristophanes presents it, is not a primary human passion. I think we kind of all miss that because it's such a beautiful account of Eros. You forget that he's arguing that's not really the, as I say, the primary human passion. It's only the derivative product of punishment for a more fundamental human impulse. Resistance to authority, or maybe the desire not to be ruled. It's open to interpretation. What was moving those original complete beings to assault the heavens? Once the punishment for that impulse produces two partial beings, Eros arises as the longing of each one to restore their completeness by fusing together with their other half into one again. Aristophanes imagines how the force of that desire at first proved so powerful, and these half-beings so obsessed with it, they abandoned all concern with all practical matters of survival and began to perish. Zeus, this time in pity, maybe? Or was he still worried about preserving his worshipers? Comes up with another plan. By moving the genitals to the front side, because remember, that was still the hole with the, now he turns around, moving the genitals to the front side, he could allow the half-beings some respite from unfulfilled longing. A man could unite with a woman and generate offspring, the condition for preservation of the species. And if a man came together with another man, he says, nothing to say about woman and woman. I guess it just wasn't his, he didn't know about that. But the two men would have at least a moment of satisfaction, making it possible to return to dealing with all the needs of life. Aristophanes' description of the search for our other half captures the deep belief that informs our erotic experience. The belief in the uniqueness of the beloved, the one and only who is destined for us and who would complete us. Of course, he does note in passing that upon the death of one half, the other goes seeking any half of the whole woman or whole man. And by the way, that would be the case for everyone after the original generation is gone. So I realized after a long time what the account makes intelligible proves to be not our attraction to a unique individual, but a typology of three classes to which Aristophanes assigns his own evaluative ranking. The original androgynous being gives rise to the relation of man and woman, who make up Aristophanes' charges the adulterers and adulteresses. Now, this one bothered me for decades. Why? Is he assuming that all heterosexual love is the source of adultery? Well, I think I have a proposal. He offers no justification for this charge. The poet seems to express nothing but his own prejudice. If, however, eros is the longing to restore the complete whole that existed prior to the division by the punitive gods of the city, the passion must be essentially antinomian. I don't know if you all know that word. Against the law, contrary to the convention in the law. And since marriage legitimates love, yoking it to the needs of family and society, the paradigm of heterosexual erotic relations would have to be found outside that institution, as every great novel has always shown. I don't know about every, but many. Aristophanes assigns the highest place in the rank order of erotic classes to the all-male pairs, whose manly nature leads them to become men active in the city. The political life is the closest fallen humans come to the assault on the heavens by the original complete beings. And remember, I better maybe remind everyone, this is Plato writing this for sure, but it is being put into the voice of this Aristophanes, of the poet, so we shouldn't assume that Plato is endorsing this position. The Aristophanic account does admit a kind of aspiration, what I call a vertical dimension in human life, but not an erotic aspiration. Eros itself, for him, is a purely horizontal relationship. That's connected with another feature. Each member of the Aristophanic pair is both a lover and a beloved of the other, and they believe they need nothing but each other. The reciprocity that is for Plato and Aristotle typically assumed to be a mark of friendship, philia in Greek. Aristophanes ascribes to eros, with the consequence that Aristophanic lovers do not aspire in and through eros to anything higher than union with one another. There's a lot in that. Maybe we can come back and discuss that later, but maybe just let me make sure this is clear to everyone, because I don't think everyone assumes this. Plato and Aristotle think of eros as really distinguishing the lover and the lover reaching out toward the beloved might not even know that the lover exists. And that's distinguished from friendship, in which you can't be a friend unless the other is your friend. Friendship is, for them, by definition reciprocal, and eros is by definition not, which creates a lot of problems. An Aristophanic lover, who is at the same time the beloved, could not suffer from unrequited love. Yet, eros on Aristophanes' account is hardly a state of fulfillment. His lovers are utterly mystified by their elusive experience of longing. They know they're seeking something more than the pleasures of sex, but, as he says, the soul only darkly divines what it is seeking. Aristophanes recalls Homer's story of the adulterous lovers Ares and Aphrodite caught in the net of Hephaestus. If, he imagines, the forger god, that's Hephaestus, came to any lovers and asked them, "What do you want?" they would be utterly perplexed. They don't know what they want. But if offered the possibility of living a single life and dying a single death, fused eternally in Hades, none would refuse. So this imagined fulfillment of love requires the ghostly underworld where the two could become one. The two natures could become one. Eros, Aristophanes concludes, is the desire and pursuit of the whole. That's his definition. Plato has him speak words that could be given a Socratic Platonic reading. After all, at least knowledge, the desire for knowledge of the whole, is what Plato means by philosophy. But the whole that the poet has in mind is something different. The completeness of the self to which each of us partial human beings longs to return. And this pursuit of the whole comes with a sense of justice, for each lover assumes a right to restore the whole that he once was. Of course, permanent reunification with our missing half would be possible, Aristophanes admits, in death alone, or more precisely, a death that could be shared by two lovers, followed by continued existence as one in Hades. The longing that defines the human condition is, it seems, a wound that cannot be healed. And if it could, it would only destroy the individuality eros was meant to reinstate. That was the whole point. Aristophanes begins with an amusing image of cartwheeling spherical humans, back-to-back doubles, whose division produced our laughable human shape. But what began as a comic portrait of fallen humans, with eros as our current defining passion, seems to have ended on a tragic note. I want to ask now whether the biblical counterpart presents another comic tragedy or something altogether different. So I'm going on to Genesis 1 and 2, man, woman, and the primordial Adam. Here, I like this from my handout because I think it's a translation that doesn't get as much attention as it should. There's a translation of the 5 Books of Moses by Everett Fox. Mostly I use Robert Alter, by the way, which is very useful and very readable and good, but Everett Fox is interesting. This is Genesis 1:27. God created humankind in his image. In the image of God did he create it. Male and female did he create them. I mean, he captures, there's something hugely problematic about this first statement about human creation. Is it a single being? Is it a double being? Is it 2 aspects of one being? And it moves in grammatically from singular to plural in the same verse. So it's really interesting. The Adam, this is all about Adam. And I guess one of my urgings today is don't take Adam to be a man, at least not initially. The Adam of Genesis 1, created by God in his own image, belongs at the pinnacle of the cosmic whole. Genesis 1, the creation of the whole universe, with Adam at the peak. This Adam is it, but also them, a being that either abstracts from the difference between male and female or comprehends both. Such a being, rabbinic commentators reasoned, would have to be a whole with 2 aspects or parts. By the way, I think I have these more other passages on the back of this. Maybe I won't take the time to read it all now, but you'll enjoy Rabbi Jeremiah ben Eliezer, the hermaphrodite with the 2 sides and the description of this. I'm looking to see if I'm going to get to this. This whole thing turns on an interpretation of the word rib, which is our traditional understanding, meaning one side of a whole. And they quote from a description, very, objective description of the tabernacle, that they built one rib of it, one side of it. So we'll need that. It is striking that this duality of Adam is described immediately after God exhorts, let us make Adam in our image and after our likeness. What's this first person plural that God is using? That happens to be the very first biblical passage that Maimonides cites in the opening chapter of the Guide of the Perplexed. It's a very fitting starting point for the challenge he faces of explaining biblical language that is incompatible with the truth as reason or science recognizes of the non-corporeality and the perfect unity of God. I mean, he's got a challenge right away. The term image, Maimonides insists, actually has nothing to do with physical looks. It refers rather to, he claims, the natural form, the essence, the whatness of a being. That which makes the human being what it is in the image of God has nothing to do with looks. It's what distinguishes human from beasts. And that, Maimonides argues, is the faculty of intellect. Adam, in the image and likeness of God, is the human as essentially mind. And the implication being that's beyond male and female or comprehensive. Both God and his human creature look very different when the next chapter of Genesis starts over again. Leaving behind the cosmic perspective, it directs its concern to the central phenomena of human life. The universal God, that's Elohim, who created Adam in his own image, is replaced by Yahweh, a potter, beautiful poetry, a potter who molds Adam from the dust of the earth, Adamah, Adam from Adamah, and breathes life into his nostrils. The human, as essentially mind, is now replaced by a concrete creature of body and soul. This Adam is meant to live in a garden with all needs supplied, filled with every tree, pay attention, pleasant to sight and good for food. We'll come back to that. With only one restriction imposed on him. He is forbidden to eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, this restriction could be understood as a natural feature of the limited life that belongs to the Garden of Eden. After all, these creatures who are almost animals, or let's say childlike, they don't have knowledge of good and evil. It looks like a description of that life. But it is presented here as God's imposition by his authoritative will of the most fundamental prohibition on human beings, apparently the most dangerous feature of human life. Now, of course, I think everyone sees this. In calling attention to the forbidden fruit of knowledge, God almost inevitably invites violation. You don't say, there's a tree right in the middle of the garden, and it's beautiful, and look at it and not expect this violation of his command. In any case, the God of Genesis could hardly have been satisfied with two childlike figures living forever, at least if the intention of the biblical text is to convey some understanding of our human condition. I mean, we would learn nothing about ourselves, right, from that. As soon as God issues his primary prohibition, for the first time he finds something not good, Adam being alone. It is not good for Adam to be alone. What God sees as not good is presumably the incompleteness of his solitary creature and his need of another. I think that's what almost everybody assumes. But if you read it against Aristophanes, in light of Aristophanes, you have to wonder whether possibly the contrary notion is lurking there. And what the biblical God, like Aristophanes' Zeus, finds not good is the completeness and self-sufficiency of the original human being. Think about it. I'm open to either alternative. To correct the problem in any case, God forms all the other animals out of the ground, that's Adamah again, and that's Adam's own element. But the only response of the human being is to bestow names on the animals, a mark of his dominion. The companion who could correct the solitude of Adam is an other that must be brought into being not by an addition, but by a separation from him. Plunged into a deep sleep, a kind of death, Adam will awaken with a permanent alteration of his very being. He is no longer a whole after God forms woman out of his rib, or one side of his body, as Maimonides notes, with an appeal to the authority of the rabbis on the meaning of the term rib. Once the human being has been split into two, Adam immediately recognizes the other formed from his side as his own, flesh of my flesh and bone of my bones. He gives her the name woman, Isha, because she came from man, Ish. Same word, feminine ending. Woman may be derivative, but man, too, appears now for the first time. Man and woman come into being as such simultaneously and in equality, I think. Woman only makes explicit what must be true of her partner as well. Each half is as partial as the other, neither identical with the whole from which they have been formed. God's splitting of Adam into man and woman is a unique event in the biblical narrative. But at this moment, that narrative is interrupted to draw from it a universal principle. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and they become one flesh. You all know that line. Very interesting. I don't know much about it, but I think it's quite fascinating. The New Testament writers take this passage to supply a deep biblical foundation for the new teaching that Jesus brings prohibiting divorce. In the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, Jesus characterizes marriage by citing Genesis 2 from the Septuagint, "They twain shall be one flesh." And his appeal, it seems, is to God's original creation as the archetype when he concludes, "What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." There's some interesting details on that we might want to come back to in a question period, or if we have time later, that you'll see on your on my handout. There's an interesting difference between the way Mark and Matthew present this. And for Mark, this teaching is in private to the disciples. So there's something esoteric or hidden about it. And it seems that what he's getting at is what we were just saying about Genesis 1. The primordial atom as one whole is the model for marriage that then can't be dissolved. So if the husband and wife separate and come together with someone else, that would be adultery. Of course, man and woman becoming one flesh is not a restoration of the complete human being, but a compensation for its loss, a corporeal displacement of the primordial atom in the image of God. By the end of the second chapter of Genesis, in any case, man and woman stand over against each other as fragments of a whole, but they don't understand themselves that way. They are naked and not ashamed. The self-awareness they lack, which belongs with awareness of the other, comes only as the result of disobedience of God. I think that's really the gist of it. They don't have it until they disobey. That defiant deed will be undertaken not as in Aristophanes' account by the self-sufficient complete human being, but rather in this case by the partial one, more precisely woman. Man, who is left from the original human once Adam was split in two, cleaves to his wife to recover that whole. Woman apparently seeks something else. I'm moving on now to Genesis 3, the prohibition against knowledge of good and evil. The story of the primeval deed of disobedience, which is told in the third chapter of Genesis, begins with a question, the first in the Bible. Shout out to your former colleague, Robert Sachs, who unfortunately is not able to be with us tonight, who notes that this is the first question in the Bible and that God, when he asks Adam this question, is imitating the serpent. And in his wonderful book on Genesis, his study of the book of Genesis. This question is raised by a talking serpent. Very unusual. The Hebrew Bible has very little mythological creatures and characters like that. But we have a talking serpent in Genesis 3. Said to be of all beasts in the field, the most subtle or clever. Got to give you another Hebrew word, arum, for clever or subtle. The prior chapter just ended with the statement that the man and woman were not ashamed, though they were naked, arumim. It's some kind of pun there. Very, very, I think, puzzling and intriguing. What is the meaning of this pun? Does serpentine cleverness involve a rejection of law that makes it somehow a distorted mirror of naked innocence? The serpent is about to assure the woman she need not fear God's threat about this forbidden fruit. Serpentine wisdom looks like a kind of natural theology, operating on the assumption that reason can determine what a divine being would intend. The serpent claims to know what God must really mean. This serpent, who appears out of nowhere and addresses the woman alone, vanishes as soon as she contemplates the forbidden fruit through her own eyes. The dialogue of the woman with the talking serpent looks like some kind of externalized representation of her inner debate with herself, in which both innocence and cunning play a role. This is all, we can, I hope, come back to this. There's a lot here. The serpent taunts the woman with an overly harsh version of God's prohibition. Were you not forbidden to eat from any tree in the garden? Presumably intending with his exaggerated restriction to arouse her resentment against a God who would make even survival impossible. She does correct him, but only with her own overstatement of the constraints. God has prohibited touching the fruit, let alone consuming it. As she sees it, just to be near this knowledge, even without making it one's own, is forbidden. The woman speaks, moreover, of, quote, the tree in the middle of the garden, apparently unable to differentiate the tree of life from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Actually, her false assumption prepares for the conclusion of the story, where the two trees prove to be so intertwined that the attainment of the forbidden fruit of knowledge requires blocking the way to the tree of life. On the day you eat of the fruit, God warned Adam, you shall surely die. The human possession of knowledge of good and evil, one might take this to mean, has an essential connection with the condition of mortality. But once the acquisition of that knowledge is construed as a crime, death is presented as a punishment. I hope you're seeing there's an underlying theme running through this and much of my reading of the Bible, that an account that looks as if it could just be a good description of the nature of things, that we need to be aware of death to have knowledge of good and evil, or awareness of death brings with it knowledge of good and evil. It could just be a description, is presented in the biblical text as crime and punishment. And I think that's runs through the entire Bible, and it's a very difficult question to think about why that should be so. In any case, the serpent refuses to admit this connection in any form. He explains to the woman, you're not going to die. God was only concealing from humans the reward for eating this fruit. Their eyes will be opened and they will become like gods. Knowledge of good and evil is sufficient for divinity, and only a jealous God, whose will alone would prevent human beings from sharing in it. Protecting his own privilege, such a deity would deny what humans might reasonably feel is their rightful possession, a recovery of their original condition created in the image of God. Looking up at the tree after her exchange with the serpent, the woman sees three features. You'll see why I asked you before to pay attention. She sees, do I have this here? I think I have it. I have it, I think. Yeah, it's at the bottom on Genesis 3. The woman sees fruit good for food, a delight to the eyes, and desirable to make one wise. The first two, a delight to the eyes and good for food, the first two were precisely characteristics originally attributed to all the trees in the garden, although in the opposite order. I don't know if that's significant. So you see, she's added a third feature, right? The desirability of this fruit to make you wise. Maimonides, commenting on this passage in the second chapter of the guide, this is really frustrating. He refers to the perception of just two features, the fruit good to eat and a delight to the eye. I think Maimonides knows what's there in Genesis 3. But he leaves something out. He refers only to those two. As a result, he can assign the blame for the deed of disobedience on appetite and imagination. I mean, that makes sense, right? Good for food, appetite, delight to the eyes, imagination. But he leaves out the third feature that the woman sees on her own, which is the unique feature of this tree. It's being desirable to make one wise. Of course, this maybe takes a long argument, although I think I take it for granted, by this conspicuous omission, one of the most obvious deliberate omissions, Maimonides draws our attention to the Bible's indication of the most profound challenge to God's rule. It's not carnal appetite, not bodily desire and imagination, but rather the human desire, the desire by human beings to acquire wisdom on their own. That's really the challenge. I think that's what Maimonides, it takes an argument, but I think that's what Maimonides implies by the very omission of this crucial feature. The serpent's attempt to arouse the woman's resentment against the willful restriction of a jealous God might sound like the voice of Platonic spiritedness. You guys have been introduced to spiritedness? Some of you have read The Republic, Thumos. I know some of you have. Juniors? Seniors? Yeah. So yeah, that's what the serpent sounds like, right? It's very angry and resentful, and this jealous God is restricting you and guarding his own territory and so on. What motivates the woman when she perceives the fruit through her own eyes sounds to me like, it is almost literal, the desire for wisdom. So this very basic Platonic theme of the relation between spiritedness and philosophy, or spiritedness and the desire for wisdom, I think is at least perhaps indicated or implied by the way the biblical authors have woven together the perspective of the serpent and of the woman, who are in a way one whole, divided in these two voices. The woman reaches out for the fruit and eats it, then passes it to her husband, who, without a word, eats of it himself. The woman's dialogue with the serpent opened up a window into her mind. We hear her thinking. The man's motivation, on the other hand, is opaque. The serpent, who has some kind of essential tie to the woman, had to seduce her. She has to seduce the man. Yet it is only when both have eaten that their eyes are opened together, as the serpent predicted. The first mark of the knowledge they acquire is the experience of shame, and they cover themselves with fig leaves. Shame motivates covering naked human nature with the clothing of law or convention. Boy, is that a long story we could tell, back to Herodotus and other things. If we have time, we might want to come back to that. But I think you get the image right away as soon as you think of it, right? Clothing as representing law or convention, covering over the nakedness of nature. The difference that naked man and woman must perceive shows up now as a sign of defectiveness, measured against the whole being from which they originated. To be man or woman is to fall short of the human as such in the image of God. While covering themselves from each other's view, man and woman hear God's voice, wafting through the garden. Another passage Maimonides has trouble with. In the cool of the afternoon, God is walking through the garden. And he calls out to Adam, "Where art thou?" As Robert Sachs tells us, imitating the serpent asking his question. Adam responds, "When I heard your voice in the garden, I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself." The shame that man and woman have before each other brings with it fear before God. Shame and fear together issue in the transformed human condition. That's it. That's the start of the human condition. Shame and fear. Some of you, have you studied the Euthyphro? Some of you. You'll remember how important shame and fear are. We can talk about that maybe if we have time. God tests Adam. Who told you that you were naked? The man shifts the blame understandably on the woman, or more precisely, on the woman he reminds God, whom you gave me as a partner. Back to you. It's on you. She in turn passes the blame on to the serpent, and God seems to concur. He imposes a curse on the serpent, which, again, makes its natural motion, slithering on its belly in the dust, into the vivid image of punishment for its crime. I mean, there's a real image, right? That's the nature of serpents, but it's presented as the punishment. God adds the rather mysterious announcement of an eternal enmity between the seed of the serpent and that of the woman. I think it's the woman, it's a little unclear. Maybe it's human beings, but the serpent, once again, looks like some projection of a feature in the complex nature of woman from which she will never be entirely freed. Now, man and woman, unlike the serpent, are not themselves cursed, but they are punished. God's initial plan, supposedly, or at least his first revision, he's got like 3 revisions already. First, there was going to be the original solitary human being. Then it looked like the plan was for a pair of innocent creatures to dwell forever in the ease of the garden. That plan must be replaced by a new one. And this is a big question for all biblical readings, whether, at least in the book of Genesis, looks to me like God is learning along with his human creatures, but obviously that's a controversial thought. The new plan, preservation of the species through sexual reproduction, not an eternal pair of immortal beings, but preservation of the species. And following again the pattern that runs through the whole biblical account, a natural function, the pain of childbirth, is explained as a matter of divine punishment, a reminder through the ages of the first woman's deed of disobedience. And you have to also, this is of course always with us, but you have to think back to those times, like how many women died in childbirth, right? So it's being presented as the authors have to know it's a natural feature of the human condition being presented as divine punishment. One further consequence for woman goes beyond her biological nature. Your desire, God announces, will be unto your husband, and he shall rule over you. That's obviously a crucial moment. Once the primordial atom was divided, man was drawn to woman to restore an original whole. What apparently attracted her, on the other hand, was the possibility of becoming like God by obtaining knowledge of good and evil. Whether it was spirited resistance against the constraints of authority, or a positive striving for wisdom, or somehow both woven together that motivated her disobedience, woman's desire must be rechanneled. Directed now toward her husband, it is meant to assure her subordination to man's rule. So I think that I'm right. That's the first time in the Bible that you get the terms of ruler and ruled applied to man and woman in the household or the family. And I think as I would try to argue, that's a transformation of Genesis 2. There was an original kind of equality, and something about the deed that this woman has done of disobedience has led to the necessity of this conventional transformation of subordination. And by the way, we won't have enough time for this for sure, but if you got me on another tactic, I think it's real interesting to follow how that runs through the whole Bible, but especially the whole family drama of Genesis. This convention about woman status, which never actually turns out to be right, which never actually happens, which goes against nature, I think they're suggesting. Okay, that's another question. Turning finally to the man, God issues a curse, not on Adam, but for his sake on the ground. We're back to the pun, Adamah. Laboring over the unyielding earth is to be another constant reminder that man is dust and will return to dust. Work, like childbirth, is ultimately a sign of mortality. Adam says nothing in response to this announcement of his fate. he reverts instead to his activity as authoritative name-giver and bestows on woman a proper name, Eve, we say, Chava, which, because she is giver of life. I think every proper name in the Bible might be a pun, in the Hebrew Bible. That's a project I'd like to pursue. But anyway, that's it now. Mother of all the living, that's what her name means, that Adam comes up with for her. Woman, in her essence, is no longer philosopher, but as Adam now sees her, giver of life. The woman's effort to achieve likeness to God through the acquisition of knowledge of good and evil has been replaced by her role in the transmission of life. A real interesting thing that we might have time to come back to is the next chapter, Genesis 4, the story of Cain, but the very first words out of the Garden of Eden are Eve boasting about giving birth, giving life to Cain. Until then, nobody but God has been able to give life, and now she has this sense of her power in giving life. So, God's encounter with Adam and Eve comes to an end with a very puzzling gesture. He clothes them, this is 3:21, he clothes them in garments of animal skins that he has produced. And that is, disturbing for one thing. At this point in the biblical account, it's vegetarian life. There's no wild animals, there's no eating of other living things, only the green plant, the green herb for food. So you have to kill an animal to make the animal skins, and God is the one who does that. But maybe even more bizarre, more puzzling, once their eyes were open after eating the forbidden fruit, remember, the first action of man and woman was to cover themselves with fig leaves. So why is that not good enough? Humans clothing themselves is apparently not sufficient. If God assumes this responsibility, the clothing should be the divine law. Following my metaphoric interpretation of clothing, I guess God's clothing them is the divine law. But why then is it represented by the image of animal skins, which would give human beings the appearance of beasts? Another thing I don't have an answer to. The transformed human condition, brought about by the possession of knowledge of good and evil, illustrates what it means to live no longer in childlike innocence and dependence. But at the conclusion of the story, expulsion from the Garden of Eden is presented not as an image of that condition, but once again as divine punishment for the human deed of disobedience. More precisely, it is a preventative policy in light of that deed. Adam, God announces, has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. So they did succeed. God says so. Has become like one of us. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. This is very weird, but people have confirmed this for me. The text stops short. It's not a complete sentence. It doesn't spell out the consequence. I gather if human beings, with the knowledge they have acquired, also became immortal, they would be not merely, as God noted, like one of us, but divine. The creation of man and woman from Adam and their experiences in the Garden of Eden make up, one might say, a myth in this sense. An understanding of the way things are is presented in an imaginative, genetic account of how they came to be. That account begins with an original condition that indicates, by their absence, the essential features that make us human. Birth and death, incompleteness and desire, shame and fear, labor and pain, ruler and ruled, the covering over of nature by the clothing of the law. In the absence of those features, the human being would be beast or God. Some of you may realize my hidden quotation there of Aristotle's Politics. The account of the universal human condition that begins here and is developed through the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis comes to an end with one more myth of this sort, another echo of Aristophanes' speech about the fragmentation of the original complete human being. I'm referring to Genesis 11. All humanity made up a kind of whole with one common language. Out of the strength of this unity, they undertook to build a city and a tower reaching into heaven. If this is what they begin to do, God worries, there is no limit to what they will attempt. Let us, he exhorts, as he did when creating the human being in his own image, let us go down and confound their language. With that, human beings will be scattered over the face of the earth. So, another central feature of life as we know it, the separation of distinct peoples with different languages, lands, and customs, is presented here as a result of what looks like divine punishment for a deed of overstepping human boundaries. I wonder, is God threatened by this deed? In his response, a defensive act in his own interest? Because it does sound, even more than the original thing, it does sound so much like Aristophanes' Zeus. Assault on the heavens and the threat and so on. So is this God's serving his own self-interest with this defensive act? Or rather, it's taken me a while to kind of flesh out this idea, or does God perhaps understand that human beings can be human only if they recognize some limit, and different peoples with different languages, with different lands, with different customs is somehow the most fundamental or a very fundamental example of that kind of limit. We need to be divided, and the benefits that come from that condition outweigh the concerns. We can think about that. It's a very timely issue, I think. Is God's thwarting, then, of this technological imperial project represented by the Tower of Babel? That's what it is. It's imperial. They want to take over the whole earth. And, it's a very elaborate description of how you bake bricks out of various clay and so forth. It's the biblical author's understanding, technology and imperialism. Even though it looks so nice, a world state, one language. Is this God's thwarting of the technological imperial project of the Tower of Babel, is it perhaps meant to save humanity from self-destruction? The story of a unified humanity assaulting the heavens and suffering the divine punishment of fragmentation translates onto the political plane the story of the original human being, split into man and woman, who then overstep their divinely given boundaries and are punished by God. These two stories frame the Bible's opening genetic account of the universal human condition with a double reverberation of Aristophanes' speech about the fall of human beings from their ancient nature. It is really striking. So hard to believe they didn't know of one another, but it frames it beautiful bookends for this resonance with Aristophanes. Because after Genesis 11, the universal condition of humanity is done, is over. Are there differences, we can now ask, between the biblical and the Platonic text that shed light on the two roots of the West, Jerusalem and Athens? Okay, thank you for your patience. We're coming to my last section. I've titled it, and I hope you'll see why in a minute, Jerusalem and Athens, Poetry and Philosophy. As an account of the relationship of love between two individuals, one difference in the content of the two texts is immediately obvious. I'm sure no one misses this. Aristophanes not only recognizes three classes of lovers, male, 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 female, and female, female, but he also seems to be depicting male homosexual eros as the highest. Their manliness, manifest in the life of politics, is the closest fallen human beings can come to the ambition of the primordial humans. Obviously, the biblical account, in contrast, recognizes nothing but the love of man and woman, which proves to be in the service of the family and the people to which the family belongs. So, obvious difference, right? You can't miss that one. But this difference in content is connected with a difference in what we could call the plot through which each narrative unfolds. For Aristophanes, the defiance of divine authority is undertaken by the complete human being out of a sense of self-sufficiency. Should we call it pride, ambition? Maybe that's spiritedness, but that's the act of defiance. And the splitting of that being into two is the product of punishment by a tyrannical deity from which eros is the derivative result. He splits them as punishment. In the biblical narrative, on the other hand, the division of man and woman from the whole human is not a result of punishment. And man's cleaving to his wife is not derivative from some more fundamental passion. Here, too, divine punishment is a response to the overstepping of human boundaries. But in the biblical story, that's the deed of the partial being, woman, motivated apparently by some sense of incompleteness. So in a way, they're really quite contrary. The place of the deed of defiance in the sequence of events implies a different motivation. In the Aristophanic tale, the original human beings are moved by their big thoughts to defy the boundaries separating their sphere from the gods of the city and the constraints of the law. If there's a biblical counterpart to those big thoughts, perhaps it's the serpent's seduction, aiming to elicit the woman's spirited resistance to the authority of a jealous God. But the biblical narrative portrays that motivation intertwined with the woman's attraction to the forbidden fruit desired for wisdom, an awareness, we might say, of what she lacks, which is what would lead us to even designate it as eros. That desire, the biblical story indicates, can only be pursued by disobedience of God's command, with the resulting punishment. And yet, it is precisely the violation of the divine authority that proves to be the first step on the path of human beings becoming fully human. Nothing about our human condition would be there in the Bible without that deed and its result. The desire for wisdom in this crucial, if ambiguous role seems to have no place in Aristophanes' account in the Symposium. Now, of course, Plato does not neglect it. Philosophia is given its place in Socrates' speech on eros, which he puts in the voice of a fictional character, Diotima, many of you know. The competition between the Aristophanic and the Socratic accounts of eros in the Symposium is the distinctive representation of what Socrates calls elsewhere the ancient quarrel between poetry and philosophy. So Aristophanes obviously represents the poetry side and Socrates' philosophy. And the suggestion seems to be that the understanding of eros is the key to that quarrel. If that's so, the quarrel between poet and philosopher must turn on the status of the erotic human quest for wisdom. This is, in fact, a suggestion Aristotle makes in the opening chapters of the Metaphysics. The context is his survey of opinions about wisdom, or Sophia, which is supposed to be the highest or the most comprehensive knowledge. Led from there to philosophy with its starting point in wonder, Aristotle finds that the only knowledge that's truly desired for its own sake, is the only free knowledge, by analogy with a free person who exists for his own sake. But just for that reason, he admits, it might be thought to lie beyond human limits, since human nature is in many ways servile or slavish. In the words he quotes of the poet Simonides, God alone would have this privilege. God alone would have the privilege of this kind of wisdom. If, Aristotle reasons, there really were anything in the poet's notion that the divine is jealous, it would be aroused above all by the human striving for knowledge. But for the divine to be jealous, he says, is impossible. As the proverbial wisdom has it, the poets tell many lies. What the philosopher understands as the natural limits of human capacity, human nature is in many ways servile, the poet presents as the prohibition of a jealous God. And what the poet construes as a criminal act inviting divine punishment, for the philosopher is erotic striving for knowledge that motivates and defines the human life most worth living. So I think it's just really remarkable that Aristotle in this couple sentences really captures, it is so reminiscent of Genesis 3, the jealous God who prohibits this wisdom. He obviously understood this possibility. I'm coming to my conclusion here. Jerusalem and Athens, then, as the two roots of the West, cannot be simply identified with Bible and philosophy, which is how I tend to do it. That's not right. For Athens is internally divided between poetry and philosophy. If Aristotle got it right, the jealous God of the poets represents within Athens the side of the Bible over against philosophy. You see what I'm doing? It's not just Athens and Jerusalem, but within Athens, poetry and philosophy looks like you've got Bible already within Athens over against philosophy. Yet the Bible, in portraying God's fundamental prohibition, acknowledges the primary status of the desire for wisdom as the challenge to divine authority. Of course, that in turn motivates the task that the whole Bible must set for itself, I take it, to demonstrate the necessity of divine guidance. In other words, they come out of the garden with knowledge, when they have knowledge of good and evil. That can't be anything but the capacity or the potential for such knowledge, which presumably the whole Bible is meant to shape and provide. In the case of Athens, on the other hand, philosophy somehow emerges out of the soil of Greek poetry. Homer is the source of Plato as much as of tragedy and its supplement in comedy. If the philosopher, Plato at least, engages in a quarrel with the poets, it is one that in some way incorporates the other and turns the external relation of two independent sources, as the Bible seems to understand it, into the internal structure of a whole. Thank you.